regarding the time, and we're going to build in now 5 minutes of quiet reflection time before our campfire, which is like our wrap up of our class. It's a 2.5-hour class, and the last 20 minutes is always like, let's all come together and talk about how, what all you got accomplished, what the next steps are. We're going to now build in a 5-minute sort of silent, like, this is the time for you to think about what it is you need to share and what it is you need to moving forward. So I'm looking forward to trying that. And that was based on us reading this book and thinking we're not really building in that looking inward time into the schedule. And we can afford 5 minutes.
Yeah.
It's tough, but.
I'd love to hear other people's strategies about how they sort of build that in. I like that idea, Rocky, of just saying, so, and you just tell the students you have 5 minutes, you can take notes, you can stare out the window, you can do whatever you want.
There was a piece, a study that came out, it was earlier this year, I think, but about the benefits of note-taking and drawing, as far, even in college level classes, and how having to translate that information from what you've just heard or read into an actual drawing makes, that is sort of that same idea of processing that information in a way and having to present it visually, which I have not done much with at the moment because I'm not teaching a class right this second, but I'm interested in looking at doing that going forward. Especially we have this whole new thing right now where all of our entire freshman class is getting iPads with little pen things. I don't even want to know how much it's costing, but they will all have these, and so they will be able to go in and use something like Sketchnote to start taking notes in class. I think that'll be interesting to see if that's something that would work. Yeah.
I tried that one time, and we just happened to have these little 5-by-7-inch whiteboards. And there was enough for everybody in the class, so I brought them in and said, okay, for the next 5 minutes, you can't use any letters or words, just for 5 minutes, but see if you can create something on this whiteboard that would help you think about or process or remember, whatever it was that we were talking about, which I don't remember. And, again, some of them thought it was great, and some, at the end had nothing on their whiteboard. They were just fearful of the whole thing.
Yeah.
I can't draw. That's another growth mindset thing. Oh, sketchnoting. Yeah, perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Cynthia. Mm-hmm.
All right, everyone. Shall we talk about a little bit of chapter 2? So next question. So I'm just going to read it. Understanding brain science as described by the author helped her confidently design lessons that were more related to the learning goals. Regarding our respective situations and institutions and roles and so forth, how can we empower others to have a better understanding of brain science in relation to learning? I feel like we've been touching on that. And what about in relation to our learning and understanding ourselves?
There's Mary. Hi, Mary. Well, as I was reading through this, I had actually just read that study before I read the book. I started there are notes everywhere. There's drawings and all of this in my book because I'm like, yeah, I totally need to translate these things and it was really helpful. Later when I went back to kind of review what I had read about, I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. It was and she uses really great analogies in the book, and I love that about her. But about the duct tape around the straw and that kind of stuff. I try to draw those pictures out so I would remember them going forward. So that's how I have used it.
Nice. I popped onto Google Images or Pinterest or one of those places, I can't remember, trying to see if I could find a coloring sheet of a brain.
So did I.
Did you? So
Yeah,
my thought, what are you going to do with it, Jim? My thought was to have students sort of think about, what parts of your brain do you think are really active, and how do you see the pieces connecting, or something like that. That was as far as I got.
I added mine into text because I wasn't sure I'd have a chance to jump in. But Cindy and I have actually brainstormed about just the fact of trying to be more transparent and overt with students about these choices. we're doing this because here's the
Right.
learning theory behind it that's going to help you do better on this rather than a quiz or whatever, whatever the things are, whatever the choices are. We have a tendency that like that's the behind the scenes part that they don't need to know. Not that we're hiding it, but it's like, oh, they don't need to know that part. That's just learning theory. It's actually really helpful if they know it, to help them understand how they're learning and make strategies to go with it. Because we're doing this kind of assignment, what are some strategies to help you with that?
Nice.
And I'll say too that the class I taught last semester was for pre-service teachers, and it was really valuable to be, and it was helpful for me as a teacher too, but to say, okay, so here is a concept map of what we're doing over this course of the semester. Here's why I gave that to you. I gave that to you because I've been in 1,000 online classes that were so disorganized, and I had no idea what the big picture was, and I wanted to see that, so I decided I would put that together for you all. And so then they were all like, oh, that's really helpful. Like, and so I think that was helpful. And when they were thinking about other parts of their semester and other assignments and stuff, to think about, well, why am I doing this? Like, what is the point of putting this in there?
I know mind mapping has been really popular in our digital literacy class. That's primarily undergraduates, but I did hear from a couple of students that they actually use that in another class. So it's good to see them transferring things from one place to another.
One of the things that, when you were talking about the concept map, Jennifer, it's something that we learned from Susie Pepper Rollins. She wrote a book called Learning in the Fast Lane, but we've integrated it into our series, and she calls them standards walls for helping kids understand the connections between the unit. Like today we're working on this, but this is how it ties to yesterday and what we're going to do tomorrow. So very, very similar to what you were talking about, Jennifer. But what we've started putting with it is that success criteria. We realized that we were missing that part with our teachers, and so the learners didn't really understand what it would look like when they achieved that. And so adding that success criteria was a really valuable part, just helping teachers understand how would I help them understand that they know this. So it's been good.
Thank you all for sharing. I guess let's move on. I have a few more questions. So also in regards to chapter 4, so I'll just read it out loud. Often learners have constructed years of negative emotions associated with learning in classroom contexts. It may take a lot of effort to actively reconstruct these appraisals. I also added, like I said, depending on our respective roles and positions, that this can also include colleagues we closely work with, or both, students and colleagues. So what barriers or negative emotions might colleagues have that could prevent them from embracing some of the concepts introduced in this chapter? I had help from Jennifer on this one. Gotta give her credit.
So this question, I just loved it because it made me go back to a very horrible experience I had as a freshman in college. I always used to sit in the front row. Well, that stopped because of this one professor who called on me out of the blue to answer a question that just threw me for a loop, and I was so incredibly embarrassed. And that really changed what I did, and really until probably my senior year in college, I sat in the back of the class. I thought, I don't have anything, sorry, there goes a car, don't have anything valuable to add. And people who know me now can't believe that, because I can't stop talking when I'm in front of a group of people. But it took me a long time to work through that, because that was a very large class. It was like Psych 101, so you know how crowded those classes are. But it did take me years to feel confident enough to talk in front of a group again because of that one experience. So I just love that question.
Yeah.
This fits so closely. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Cynthia.
This fits so closely with the discussion on a fixed mindset. If your students walk through the door with, our students are faculty, so we hear, I don't have time for this. This doesn't apply to my discipline, whatever. I think we have to be really intentional about the engagement piece at the very beginning to make sure that there's a connection between what we have to offer and relevance in their practice, in their teaching. And I'm sure that Rocky can do that much more. She's much more articulate than I am, so she probably can do that better. But that's just what's going through my brain while I'm reading this.
So the negative emotions, I associate that with I had a group of 10th graders. They come in and they are different because they're not juniors or seniors. And the sad thing about these 10th graders is someone somewhere has beat them down, that they feel that they can't learn anything.
Yeah.
And so I spend a great deal of time building them back up, and I feel like I'm a cheerleader half the time and an educator very little, but just getting them to feel that they are part of our learning community. One of the boys this year admitted that in my classroom was the first time he had ever read a book from cover to cover. And he was so proud of himself, and so was everyone else. And those negative emotions, I never want him to feel that way again. And I'm trying to get him in my class next year again, because it's possible, because I just want to keep building him up, because he has so much potential. And it is sad that they have to feel that way about school. But his attendance was better, and everything was so much better by the end of the year. But yeah, those negative emotions are horrible.
I would like to throw into there too, very similarly, I think it's so important that the school culture as a whole, not just the classroom, support that. And it isn't something we necessarily have a whole lot of control over. But when I started teaching years ago, I taught middle school English. And I had 8th grade reading class, and my lower level reading class, the one that had students who had different learning disabilities and, it's all kinds of things. The curriculum that I was to teach, that class didn't read whole books. So my other class would read like The Giver, but this class would read these little prompts that are, these little story things that are in another book, because supposedly they can't handle a whole book.
No, they can't.
And I remembered fighting pretty hard. I think there was like 2 books. I think I wanted to get Monster, if anyone's read that. Again, middle school literature, if you're into that world, you know what I'm talking about. But anyway, it's a book that's a much lower barrier in terms of difficulty to read. It's written pretty straightforward, but it's a whole book, and it's an interesting topic about a boy who's in the criminal justice system and whether or not he committed a crime or was involved in a crime. And I was like, this would be great. It'd be great if they could read this book. And I went through a lot of hoops and was not at that job. I didn't last at that job very long, but while I was there, it did not work. I did not get, I even I crowdsourced the funding to pay for the books, but they would not allow us to change the curriculum. So without the support of the administration, it's hard to change that culture. I still totally remember like giving everybody back their money who I had rounded up on Facebook, because this is before we had like GoFundMe or whatever, where I was like, oh, come on, I want to buy copies of Monster for all these kids. But if the support's not there, then it's hard to fight that.
That's something I'm finding as I'm writing my massive literature review, is the organizational structure and the systemic issues in these institutions. Is it can be grassroots level and move that way, but it's a lot harder with the support. And then also another thing is like it takes a campus thinking together and working together for like real change to happen, whether that's in terms of the culture, the curriculum, and it's kind of, I can imagine it's really frustrating, and I'm sorry that happened.
I taught arts and humanities, but in the same way that people have a barrier in their mind against math, a lot of people also have a barrier against art and music, thinking they can't do that, or I'm not very good at that, or whatever. And so like one of the things that was really helpful, and this is K-12, but like was planning lessons up front that I knew would be a quick and easy win for everybody so that like they could have a success straight out of the gate. And that helped, I think, sort of build that back up to where at the end of the school year they were, looking forward to doing things, and they were asking if they could use this material or this or whatever. But it's about, I think it's about building that back up and having to sort of break down those negative emotions and really examine things and rephrase. I had to rephrase things for students all the time. Well, I can't draw. And I'd say, well, no, you just haven't learned how yet. Or, I can't do this, or I can't do that. And I would say, no, it's just that no one's taught you in a way that works for you yet. And having to constantly rephrase that really made students think about, well, wow, well, maybe that's true. I don't know. Who knows? Yeah.
I think that strategy of giving students opportunities early to have success that they can build on is critical to the success of the class. We try to do that in our digital literacy class, but it depends on the level that the student is arriving at the class with.
All of this is such rich feedback. I'm taking so many notes, and the group chat is super wonderful. I plan on saving it. Okay, so I added a bonus slide last night. So I didn't add it to Twitter, but I added it here because I found it very, I don't know, there's all kinds of words I can use. Jennifer, I don't know how to talk about it, but here, I'll put it up. So, in a lot of this, I have to credit to Jennifer. I was like, yeah, so I'm in Southern California, and I don't see a lot of things like this. And she was, bringing to my attention that, like this is still here. So that said, as you can see, there's two images. I screenshot the second image with the little caption Jennifer wrote in the email. These are controversial mural inside the University of Kentucky's Memorial Hall, where classes are still being held. And Allison makes, connection to these, not specific these, but, in general to these racist murals in college classrooms and the impact that they can have in students, and stereotype threat being one of them. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty typical, unfortunately, of the area of the country I live in. And we don't consider ourselves the South. Well, that's not true. They consider themselves the South here, but come on. Kentucky was technically a border state, but this is not unusual for where I live. The University of Louisville, just down the road, had a Confederate statue removed from its campus earlier, like in the last year or two, but only after like enormous protests occurred, right? And so like, how many students have sat in this class, who had walked in to go take their final exam, students of color, who have looked on the wall to see people picking whatever in the fields before they go in to take an exam? Like, how many students have done that? Oh my God, I can't even. And I know, so I worked at the Kentucky State Department of Education before I came here. And I know, I worked in advanced placement. And one of the things, they did a study using, how at the beginning, before you take a standardized test, you have to fill out the bubble things with like your name and your whatever number and your demographics and all that. And so they did a study where they had one group fill out the bubble things like normal, including demographic information. Then they had another group that they gave that information. It was pre-printed on there. It was already done. They didn't have to do anything with it. And just that made a huge difference for students in minority groups who didn't have to fill all that out before they took their test. The ones who didn't have to fill it out, who it was already there, they did better on their AP exams than the students who had to fill that in and be reminded right before they took their exam that they're in a class or in a group or whatever that has been marginalized. And like, just that had a huge impact. I can't imagine what something like this would have.
Wow.
I can't. I'm not capable of understanding that.
I was having a phone conversation yesterday with a Twitter friend, Robin Concoran Lar. I'm going to mess up her name, but it doesn't matter. We were talking about this concept of bias and how, like I know that this is a part of the work that I need to do, but it's not something I'm comfortable with. And I know how sensitive that you have to address this. And so I'm so interested in any resources, activities, ideas, website, to really address this, because I know that it has to be done well. And I need more help in that area.
Mm-hmm.
I think tying into, the art or the names of streets or the memorials and things like that is also the representation of the content, whether or not people are seeing representation, what their minority group is in either, again, I was an English teacher, so like the authors that we're covering, like what is being covered. I know if you follow the Ditch That Textbook guy on Twitter, there was a whole hullabaloo this week. And he had a panel that I'm sure had great information, but only afterward did he realize that every single person on the panel was white, and he got called out for it. And it's amusing when I saw his post saying about, the panel went great, and I saw like a picture of it. I automatically assumed, like I'm scrolling down my Twitter, I didn't even read his text yet, because you look at the picture first, right? I mean, that catches your eye. I automatically assumed that someone was sharing that picture to point out that there was no diversity. And then I realized that was not his goal. He was just sharing the picture of the panel. And I was like, ooh, ouch, like not good. And he apologized. And there's a whole, if you can follow that if you're curious about that world. I don't know if you follow him or not. He does have some interesting ideas. But
what's his name again?
His thing is Ditch That Textbook.
Ditch That Textbook. Okay.
Yeah. I forget what his real name is. Somebody else has it?
I'm looking.
I'm looking too. I'm sure he has a real name. I don't remember. But like his handle or whatever is Ditch That Textbook, and that's like the book he wrote. Anyway, so there was a big hullabaloo about his panel, and that has nothing to do with his actual pedagogy stuff. I think ditching textbooks and trying to be creative is a great idea, and he does have a lot of suggestions. But it just brought up the whole point that he acknowledged that he somehow was blind to that. That to him, he saw that picture and said, "Oh, this is great! I've got a picture of our panelists," and he threw it on Twitter. And someone else like me looks at that picture and says, "Oh man, do not advertise that. Like that is a problem. Like you should have noticed that before they were all standing on a stage together." But he didn't until someone called out, and he was very respectful about his apologies. But it's a very interesting conversation. Do you see that what is being shown to your students is representative of your students?
Right.
That's another thing I'm exploring in my literature review is implicit bias, microaggressions, all these little things you don't realize. Oh, thank you for sharing. All right. I guess with all that said, I mean, anyone think of any strategies we can use to leverage to help students have more control regarding their emotional, I've missed the word, inner classrooms. I think I read that funny. Apologies.
I mean, I think a good place to start is just acknowledging that, hey, we're all coming into the class today at a different place. Like we're all coming in, and I can't remember where it was in the book, but somewhere in there she's got it's like a chart thing, and there's like a emotion something, and I can't remember how. Oh, it's like energy level maybe and emotional something. Does anybody remember what I'm talking about?
I do. Exactly.
No idea where it is. But yeah, I think even just saying this is a thing. Like when you come into class, sometimes you're not ready for class. And sometimes I'm not ready for class as the instructor. Like emotionally, we had to put my dog to sleep and like I'm in a terrible mood today. And I might be kind of snippy if that's the case, but acknowledging that that's a thing and giving students a few moments to process that and really determine where they are, which is what she talked about in that part of the book. I really like that part a lot.
Just taking the emotional temperature of the class, especially if there's been some big upheaval or something really upsetting in the news. We have to acknowledge that these things are happening and they're distracting our students from the content that we have to deliver to them.
I would toss in we have a bit of a benefit in the way it's been able to happen is that we're at a religious college, And we actually start each class with a little sort of devotional. Usually we'll like share a verse. We'll talk a little bit about, how we're feeling and our goals toward, the religious side of what we're doing. And I think that's not something I've done previously. I've always worked at public schools, and I'm sure you could do an equivalent at a public school that's not religious, but it gives that opportunity to stop and be like, hey, I've really been struggling this week. I've been discouraged. I've been, and that's been really good to be able to lift each other up. And I'm sure I could do a non-religious version of that, but I never thought of doing that back when I taught. I just, dove right in. So spending the 5 to 10 minutes that we spend, at the beginning, kind of talking. Now we have 2.5 hours, so it's a night class, so we have a longer period of time with them. But it's a good use of time to kind of have everybody stop and check how they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing this with my undergrads for a couple of years now. Is just 2 minutes of quiet at the beginning of class, and I have a little singing bowl. So and I tell them, my only rule is you can't put your head down on your desk. You need to sit up. And you can close your eyes, you can keep your eyes open. Some choose to doodle, but most just sit quietly. And I said, don't worry about the time. I'll let you know when you're done. And if you're late for class, you have to stand in the hallway until we're finished, because I don't want you interrupting. But many students have said, I feel like this is the only time during my day or even my week that I just that I'm just quiet and still. And at the end of every semester, I say, okay, so what's the stuff I should never, ever do again? And what's the stuff that I should always do? And they always, to a student, say, keep that 2 minutes of quiet.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
I just was at a training not long ago on trauma-informed practices, and the presenter actually did this throughout the day at every transition, where she did the deep breathing, and just 3 cycles, and she just used a breathe in at 4, hold at 4, and blow out at 4, because she said that's kind of a comfort level. Many people can do it for much longer, but so there was not very much time taken, but every time we had a transition, she did that. And that was so helpful. And it made me think of that reflective piece that we were talking about a few minutes ago. And just putting some of those things in place in your routines, I think, could be helpful.
Great ideas.
Yeah. I was thinking people probably have seen the adorable little YouTube videos of typically elementary school, but there's ways for the teacher to greet the students as they come into the classroom, or sometimes there's a little student and they can pick the high five or the hug or this or that. And I'm reluctant to do exactly that with my college kids, but I do think that, greeting them as they start their class with me is an important thing to do. And I'd like to be a little more systematic about that, to make sure that I do at least say hello to everybody. I don't really do attendance taking, although maybe I should. Anyway, but I'd like to do something like that they can, some way to connect with them at the beginning of class.
I found that thing. It's on page 131. It's this one, the mood meter thing. I don't know if you can see that or not. But yeah, it's got, what I like is how she's got the where I am and where I need to be. And so like she talks about how once you've determined where you are, we still need to get some learning done. So let's figure out what do we need in order to get there. I like that a lot.
That's great. All right. Shall we move on? And everyone can see the screen, right? Okay. Because I don't, on my little tab, it says your screen sharing is paused, and I'm like.
Well, we have question bonus chapter 4. Is that what you want us to see?
Yeah, that's where we're at,
okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, then it's working. Good. Okay. So on 102, the author explains that emotion is essential for memory. The more information is presented through multiple sensory perceptions, the higher the likelihood of the content being remembered. So how can we integrate emotion and engagement strategies to enhance memory? I just listened to this podcast. It's called Work Life with Adam Grant and Ted or something like that. Is anyone familiar with that? I really like it, but I love anything that has to do with TED Talks. And one of the episodes is on memory, and I forgot his name. It's like the memory champion.
That's ironic.
US champion. Joshua Foer, he talks about a memory palace. Has anyone heard of this? He says the way he memorizes things, and obviously I guess his sensory is like visual and maybe the feelings he gets, but he goes to different rooms in his house. And he remembers, he looks at an object, I think is what they were saying on the podcast. He looks at an object and attaches like a feeling to it, I believe. And he just keeps doing that. That's his practice, and that's how he built his memory. So I thought that was so interesting. I was like, oh, I'm going to try that. Memory palace.
Thanks for the resource, Barb.
Do other people use storytelling in there? I'm always telling stories as I'm trying to illustrate a concept, I guess. I'm looking at page 102, and I have this sort of better recall of events when told through an emotional story. And I think that can be really powerful, and that and it's a nice way to, I think, to review concepts too. Remember the story about the dog running down the street or whatever it was. That seems to jar their memory, and then we can get back to the concept or whatever it is that we're talking about in an easier way.
But we move on to the last question. Thanks, everyone. A lot of good stuff in the chat. I highly recommend everyone check that out. Okay, so the last question I have is I got it from Read, Respond, and Discuss on page 106. And it's think of something you remember well. How did you use visual, auditory, kinesthetic, and memory? And any examples of having done this in your position. I also, like Jennifer, studied music, and I feel like so much of my learning is related to my musical training. I even in my private flute lessons, even when I teach or lecture or anything like that, I apply so much of what I learned from my musical training to kind of engage people. I guess that's the performer in me. But yeah, I'm curious what you guys have experienced.
So I direct a church camp for 1 week in the summer. I just got back actually this last week. But last year, I was actually at a different camp, and that director wanted the kids to learn like all the books of the Bible in order. I was like, we have 1 week. Are you serious with that? But then she found this hilarious song on YouTube somewhere. And so like they listened to the song like two or three times a day, just as part of the things they were doing. And then she had my daughter make up movements to go with every book of the Bible. And I'll be damned if those kids did not learn. I mean, like, yeah. I'd say at least half of the camp learned all of and they can still sing it to you today. So being able to combine all those things, and like at the end, so many of them were able to do it. They were so proud of themselves that they could do it. That, pulls that emotion in with it. We were having fun while we were doing the motions because some of them were silly, and so it pulls all of those things in, and they just really did. I was floored actually, but in the back of my mind, I was like, UDL, yay, for the win.
That's how I can do the alphabetized states, the United States. Is there
right? The 50 Nifty song. Yeah.
Right.
Classic.
And a song to learn how to spell Massachusetts, which as a young child was a very important thing to figure out how to do. But it's funny how I'll sing it in the back of my head as I'm writing.
Yeah.
I do that with Mississippi.
Crooked letter, crooked letter.
You betcha. It's interesting how those little songs. And it's interesting that we remember the songs that have actions related to them. I think that's tying in two pathways in the brain, and it just makes it a little stronger.
Absolutely.
I have this silly example when I teach flute lessons. When I teach rhythms to beginners, it's always about food. So triple notes are hamburger, hamburger. Eighth notes are French fry, French fry. Anyway.
Pepperoni pizza, pepperoni pizza.
16 notes, yeah. I love it.
I had a book as a kid on sign language and just on the alphabet. I don't know if anyone's seen this book, but what they'll do is they'll have the picture of the hand, right? And they've got a letter A or whatever, and they've got the picture of the hand. Well, I guess this is S or whatever, but it doesn't matter. And they have something to do with the picture, like has the letter. So like J is dipping your finger into jam. H is your fingers going through a hole. S, which is like, I think here or here, has like stamps all over it. Like, so like I remembered for years, I had this book as like, you know, a 6-year-old or something. I remembered for years the full alphabet because I could picture the picture, you know. I was like, oh, stamp, I need this. You know what I mean? Like I could picture that. And I always thought, I mean, that's UDL, obviously. You're kind of combining the different pathways to be able to put it in there to anchor it.
Right. And then they can access it faster, right?
Yeah.
Because of all the extra interconnections. I love that. I think that's so great. Well,
I like.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just really liked this chapter in general because of the working memory piece, and you know, working with students with disabilities, that is such a part of what they struggle with. And so I just liked some of her ideas. Like one of the things I never thought about, and I feel like, wow, I should have thought about this, like having a separate workspace for each part of a problem so that they could even visually think about, okay, when I'm doing that step, oh, I was at that table with that visual support or whatever. I just thought she has some really nice ideas about helping people understand and support the working memory. So I just, in general, like this chapter.
I've heard some people talk about that with like anchor charts that like K-12 teachers will put up on their wall, you know, that should remind you of the whatever things. And so they said that they'll have those up, but then they have to take them down for testing. But they'll see kids that are taking the test and will look up at that spot until they remember what was there and then go back, even though there's nothing there, and then go about their thing. And then even that helps them to remember, which I think is pretty cool.
Beautiful.
Well,
I think I have heard something about that regarding e-text. That was a problem for a Latin professor because students remembered the location on the page. It was on the bottom, on the right-hand side. And when you move to an e-text, you don't have those geographical page references to jar your memory. I thought that was interesting.
That's how I memorized. I have done some community theater, and that's how I memorized scripts. I'll be like, I don't remember this line, but it's on the bottom right corner of the page, and I can see it in my head, but I don't know what it is. Yeah, it's real.
I guess we should conclude. I'm sure everyone's got.
Oh my gosh, we're at time.
I know. It's crazy.
That's a fast hour.
Yeah.
I learned so much from all of you. I'm probably like the newest into UDL, I think, but I love it. Thank you so much for letting me try this hosting thing, Jennifer, and all our wonderful participants. And I look forward to the next book club. I think it's on July 11th, same time. And I don't know, anything else? Anything you want to add, Jennifer?
Well, I mean, we would love to have somebody else lead the meeting if you all want. So you can message me later if you don't want to be put on the spot right now. That's okay. All right. Well, cool. Well, I will. So I remembered to start recording after we talked through our whole discussion about learning styles. So sorry, I did not capture that. My bad. But we will have a recording of some of the conversation. So that's good. So I'll put that on Twitter as soon as it's ready to go. Don't know. Actually, I think I can caption it. So I think we should be good there. That's all I've got. I hope everybody has a good weekend. Have a great 4th of July. Be safe. And if you need anything, hit me up on Twitter. All right,
Thank you
bye,
very
everybody.
much.
Very much.
Bye.
Bye.